All right. Well, Brian, thanks so much for joining me on this episode of Skull Session Salute, where we pay tribute to the late, great Bob Nalbandian. Obviously, a guy I know you knew for decades, before Metal Blade Records was even, I believe, conceived, back to the early fanzine days. I know where both you and Bob were leading the charge in Southern California in terms of promoting and helping to push metal, where the genre wound up becoming and was in its infancy back then. But before we get into your history with Bob, Brian, last year I know 2022 it marked Metal Blade's 40th anniversary. So, I mean, 40 years since the release of that iconic and probably most important, I would say, compilation in heavy metal history, the first Metal Massacre, which of course featured Hit the Lights, the first track ever recorded by Metallica. So, Brian, 40 years, I'm sure you have to pinch yourself when you think about the label now being active for that long. I mean, did you ever envision Metal Blade as a career, or was it simply just a hobby when you started this venture?
No, I never would have dreamed any of this stuff would have happened. I was just a fan that, I had a fanzine. I worked at a record store. I was obsessed with the new wave of British heavy metal.
Mhm.
And kind of the compilation album just came about because I was frustrated by seeing bands that I really liked before that never went anywhere in LA. A big example is this band called Exciter, not the Canadian one, but the LA one that featured George Lynch.
Mhm.
And they were like my favorite heavy metal band when I was in high school. Thought they were amazing. Thought they were going to be the next Van Halen, and just nothing ever happened. They never went anywhere. Of course,
Mhm.
George joined Doc, and there's a couple other bands that I saw early on in LA in those days that nothing happened with them. And here we go, where there's a metal scene in LA, which I had no idea. One of the guitar player from Bitch actually used to come into the record store all the time, mention that there was a scene there. So I was like, really? I had no idea. And I went, the first show I saw was Motley Crue and Rat at the Troubadour on a Wednesday night for $1.
Wow.
I was like, oh wow, there are metal bands in LA. So I just trying to help do something. I never thought as a career. I thought I was going to be a journalist, probably more than anything else. And then it just kind of evolved into this label, and it's still hanging around 40 years later.
Yeah, so it's amazing, man. Well, like you said, prior to obviously doing Metal Blade, like we were saying, the new heavy metal review, that was the fanzine. I know that you were running out of Los Angeles. And I think a lot of metal fans, I think, in some of the younger generations, they don't really understand really how metal was such a, organic and fan driven thing that was really championed by fanzines like you were doing. Obviously, you were in the LA area, and of course, another champion of metal from Southern California was, of course, Bob Nalbandian, and he was running the Headbanger out of Orange County. And guys like yourselves, I mean, you were so really instrumental in getting those classic new wave of British heavy metal bands, notoriety here in the States. We recently talked to John Gallagher from Raven, who mentioned, to us that it was guys like yourself and Bob who really were on the front lines for metal in those days, and they wouldn't have really gotten to the point they had gotten if it wasn't for guys like you. So, I mean, I guess just talk, I guess, a little bit about the days when you were helping to promote really the Ravens and the Iron Maidens and Diamond Heads here in the States. But how did you really become first aware of and heard of those bands, considering that they weren't really being pushed or promoted much at all here in the States?
Well, when I was younger, when I was in high school, I was a bootlegger, and I would basically
Okay.
record all the shows, and I'd trade them all around the world because I trade them for other people's tapes. So anyway, I was trading with a guy in Sweden that had a bunch of really good stuff, and he sent me AC/DC live show in 1978. On the very end of it, he said, "Hey, there's this new band, Iron Maiden, who just put out an EP called the Soundhouse Tapes. I put it on the end of this cassette for you. It's free to check it out. You might like it." Of course, they listened to it and thought, "Oh my gosh, what is this? This is just incredible." And that led me down the path of the new wave of British heavy metal, which was really, at the time I was into I was into metal, obviously, but I was also, a big new wave scene in LA with like Oingo Boingo and the Go-Go. Well, the Go-Go's were kind of punk rock at that time, but a bunch of bands like that. And then there's the punk rock scene with, all the LA bands, and the Dead Kennedys would come down all the time. So I also was, love metal. So I was into all these different styles of music. And then when I heard the new wave of heavy metal and got into that, I threw everything else away and said, okay, this is amazing. And I just love the undergroundness of it, the do-it-yourself versions of all that stuff. So I went about collecting all those records, reading about it in Sounds magazine, which lucky enough, we had a couple record stores in LA that would carry it. So I had some familiarity, and, I had some pen pals from the back of the magazines, and just kind of started out. And then there was nothing in the US. There was no coverage, no nothing. So I started basically the first ever U.S. heavy metal fanzine, just to try to get, again, just try as a fan, just to get the word out somehow. And sure enough, found out that there were all these people all around the world that were into the same stuff, which kind of blew me away, because I was here in LA with like my one friend, and we were only two. And then a third when we met Lars. And then, and then you start this community all around the world with people that love this music.
Yeah, no, I was going to say, yeah, because when I just from when I'm my looking at things and from the the history of all this, and what I can conclude, and correct me if I'm wrong, but like you kind of just alluded to, I mean, the fact that it really was a regional thing at that time with metal, right? I mean, obviously, obviously not just domestically here too as well. You had a lot of, like I said, overseas, Sweden, Germany, UK, you name it. But most major cities, I know, here at least in the States, they had their metal scenes. Obviously, L.A., New York, and San Francisco. Now, of course, had Fanzine. You had Ron Quintana doing with Metal Mania up, in San Francisco. So each region really had its own sort of representation, I think, through the fanzines, which eventually led to, obviously these scenes eventually they kind of like, merged. I mean, obviously Metallica signs, obviously with a label in the East Coast, Raven signs with the same label, Megaforce. Obviously, it's simultaneously, you started obviously Metal Blade around the same time, around the early 80s to 82, I believe, which initially I know you were focusing on the local bands, as you mentioned, but of course, then by the time you had your third Metal Massacre that came out, you had bands that weren't from the region, like Snow White on there and Virgin Steel and so forth. So, I mean, how vital were, in your opinion, I mean, I guess the zines that you and Bob and everyone else had started in terms of really building up, as you just mentioned, the community where it became this global, phenom not too long after the fanzines and Metal Blade really were launched? I mean, could the scene, in your opinion, have flourished, I would say, without having those zines in those early days? Or you think it would have just kind of fell flat without them?
It's hard to say, of course, but clearly those things were a huge help, because remember, this is 1981, 82. There's way before the internet or anything like that. So it was really difficult for people to find out information. And even then, you'd send a pen pal letter to somebody and wait weeks to get it back. And same thing with the tapes. You'd wait to get tapes back. And then when I did the fanzine, I just thought it was going to be kind of a local thing. But then I found out there are record stores in other parts of the country. And I knew them through the distributor that I was buying all the imports from at the store as well. So all of a sudden you start finding there's a community out there of other people that are into this stuff. And then there's more fanzines, Bob's and Ron Quintana's and KJ Doughton, and all these guys started their fanzines over here, which was very similar to what had happened in Europe, because you had like Aardschok and some of these other zines that were happening in Europe covering what was going on there. Because then it went from not just the new wave of British heavy metal, but then there's Merciful Fate, and then there's Accept, and then all these other bands in other parts of Europe that were coming through too. So it was pretty amazing. But I think that kind of grassroots followings with the fanzines, and even the independent labels and the bands that in the new wave of British heavy metal that put stuff out themselves, all that kind of people working together kind of created this scene and had it start to grow.
Sure. Yeah, no, absolutely. And the thing about Metal Blade is that, I mean, I don't know if a lot of people, I mean, I know a lot of people do know, but I think there's a significant amount of people that don't really understand that it was really the first, independent metal record label. I mean, obviously Mike Varney, I know, started Shrapnel up in the Bay Area. So you guys were both sort of came out around the same time, I believe, but his was obviously more focused on the guitarist and the virtuosity, whereas Metal Blade was more band and group oriented. I mean, so at the time that you were starting Metal Blade, I mean, to do something like that, obviously during those days took, I mean, such dedication and drive. I mean, when you started, was there a sort of need that you felt to maybe, because you had all these other fanzines, was it sort of like, okay, you wanted to sort of maybe separate yourself a little bit and do something a little different to make the New Heavy Metal Review sort of maybe stand out a little more? So, no, or you just,
I was just merely a fan that wanted to share my love of this music to as many people as possible. So okay. I don't, in fact, I don't think there was really any competition necessarily, but especially between the fanzines. We're all just huge fans that for whatever reason wanted to help out. And I couldn't play an instrument, so I couldn't be in a band. So I thought, well, I guess I'll do all the other stuff and, work at a record store and do a fanzine. And, I started booking shows in LA and helping with the local radio station on their 1 hour of metal every week. And, all these sort of things, just trying to help promote, the music because I loved it and I wanted other people to hear what I thought was really great. And luckily, other people seem to like it as well.
Nice. Yeah. Yeah. Well, and speaking just real quick, talking about Bob, I mean, obviously, a lot of people I've talked to when doing this, these episodes, a lot of them, a bunch of them have said that they first met him usually, at a show, say like at the Country Club in Reseda, which obviously I know was a big club back then that put on a lot of metal shows. But also, there's a lot of people that were saying, you know what, I can't really remember the first time I met him. I just know he was always around, and they just obviously knew him just because he was just a big part of the scene. What was, if you can remember, I know it's been 40, plus years, but when was the first time you, if you can remember, ran into Bob or started connecting to him? Was it through the fanzines originally, through the Headbanger?
I knew you were going to ask that. I was trying to rack my brain. My recollection is, and like I said, it's been a long time. I think I first met Bob at an Armored Saint show because
Okay.
he was tight with those guys, and he was Orange County, and I was far away from that. I had gone to shows in Orange County, but not a whole lot. So there's a whole different scene happening out there. So I'm pretty sure the first time I met him was when Armored Saint, probably the first time I saw Armored Saint. And then, we started talking. And again, here's another guy that, loved all the same music that you loved, all the European bands and the newer British heavy metal. It was always, whenever you met those people, especially way back then, you're instantly connected. You're instantly friends because you're into the same music. And there weren't a whole lot of people that are into it. And, Bob was just as into it as I was or anybody else was. So it's always fun to find those, kindred spirits, I guess.
Sure. Yeah. Well, and one of the things that Bob, obviously was known for as both a youngster and really until the day he left us is that, and it doesn't matter who you talk to, but they always say, I mean, he was always about the music and really helping bands and bringing obviously people together. And that was never really about any money or notoriety. No one ever, heard him talking about, making any money or if doing anything he did, and so as a guy, as yourself, who's known him for, like I said, 4 decades plus, I mean, do you agree with that? I mean, especially as two of you guys were the biggest fanzines, obviously, in Southern California. I mean, did you ever sense that was any sort of like you kind of just said, really, there was no competition or anything, but was he always just about the music and joining forces with everyone to try to promote and help out these bands? Yeah.
Yeah, Bob was one of the most passionate people about heavy metal that I ever met. Like he was all about the music. His whole life was about how can I promote the music? What can I do to help it? What outlets can I do? And he's done, so many different things, but he's always been about the music. And, every time I'd see him, we talk about, whatever the new releases were, or, what are you listening to? Or, all that sort of stuff. And it never changed the entire 40 some odd years I've known him. He literally didn't change as a person. He was the same guy that he was when he was 20 something in his 40s, and still loved the music and still was passionate about it. And every time I saw him, he's wearing a band t-shirt and the whole thing. So he was a real genuine guy, number one. And number two, obviously a huge metal fan and was in it for all the right reasons, and an OG guy from day one, pretty much. So I had a mad amount of respect for Bob because there's not, you see people over the years and they kind of come and go, and especially if they're not in a band or whatever. And he was always a consistent presence on the LA metal scene and just the metal scene in general.
Yeah, no, and like I said, so many people say the same thing, that he just never changed. He was just always the same guy. They knew when they first met him, like I said, 4 years ago. So just going back to Metal Blade now. I mean, obviously, Metal Blade it became the home of obviously so many iconic metal bands in the '80s. We can go on forever about the bands that have been on the label over the years, but I'm going to fast forward just a little bit to the end of the '80s, that decade, and bring up obviously. I know you probably get asked this a lot. One of the more interesting signings, I would say, in the label's history, obviously, is when you signed the Goo Goo Dolls in the early part of their career at the end of the '80s. There, in '89, I believe you released the second LP there, Jed. They had, and they were obviously such a different band, more of a power pop sort of punk band with some thrash elements. Obviously, way before they became a radio, pop rock bands in the mid to late '90s. But I mean, I know, of course, Metal Blade, no stranger when it comes to signing some unconventional bands that you typically might not see released on a metal label. But that one really obviously stands out more than the others. And it wasn't like you just put out one record. I mean, you put out about, I think, 4 records, I believe, by them.
We had
correct?
5, I believe. Actually.
5. Okay, so 5. So I mean, you saw something with them, and that was, of course, though, right around the time when metal was really on the downward spiral in terms of popularity with rock and music fans, as grunge really started to obviously come in and take over. So, why? I just always wanted to know, what was it that made you sign them? I mean, did any of it have to do with the fact that you saw how metal was maybe about to go through probably a painful period, and thus maybe you wanted to kind of dip your toes into that alternative grungy waters? I mean, talk a little bit about that signing.
Well, kind of what happened is we had a lot of connections in Buffalo. Mike Faley, who's worked with the company forever and still does, was from Buffalo, so he had
Okay.
connections there. That's how he found Cannibal Corpse, and then the Goo Goo Dolls were kind
Mm.
of the same thing, where he and our A&R guy William Howell, at the time, famous DJ Will,
You're welcome.
heard their first record and thought it was really good. And we had a punk label called Death Records, and the reason that came about was DRI opened for Slayer. I thought they're amazing. At the same time, DJ Will again had heard about Corrosion of Conformity, so we had these records. And I grew up being a big punk rock guy. Loved all the LA scene in punk rock. I
Mm.
loved, obviously, the Dead Kennedys were my favorite punk rock band of all time. But I was into I liked that stuff. And so I went to both DRI and COC and said, "Hey, I'd love to work with you guys." And they both said, "Well, we can't." I said, "Well, why not?" Because you have a metal label, and at that point, punk and metal did not
Oil
play
and water. I know.
they
Yeah.
did not play well together.
Yeah.
I said, "Well, what about if I just started another label and called it something else? Would that be okay?" And they said, "Sure." So we started Death Records, and that
Okay.
became DRI, COC, Ugly Americans, Dr. No, the infamous Mentors,
Mhm.
Cryptic Slaughter, and the Goo Goo Dolls. So it's a pretty wide, interesting array of bands. But the Goo Goo Dolls in the very early days were very punk rock. Johnny only sang about half of the songs, and so it was the other stuff was total punk rock stuff. So I love them. I thought they were really great, and just people ask me all the time about that. I said, well, to give you the credibility, they did open for Cannibal Corpse a couple times in Buffalo, and they did okay. But I just thought they were
Wow.
fun. They were really great songs. They had a really good edge to them. Never in a million years would we think that they would become, I mean, that song name was just kind of an afterthought on that record, and that was the one that
Sure.
made them huge. But their early stuff was really, it was really fun pop punk rock stuff, and I just thought they were great. They were amazing live. Like, they were so much fun live and had this great energy, and so we loved them. Whole label, everybody loved them, and we loved working with them. And then, yeah, of course, they just kind of went crazy. But recently, I was watching Sunday Night Football, and the Bills were playing. So they always play Buffalo music coming in and out of the bumps, as they call them.
Mhm.
They played a Goo Goo Dolls song, and I was kind of like, I didn't rewind it. I go, yeah, so I'm trying to figure out what it was, because I didn't listen to Goo Goo Dolls, but I think it's from Superstar Car Wash. And what I didn't realize was how similar, especially those last couple of records before they made it big, sound exactly like the Foo Fighters. Like, I listened to that record,
really?
oh my gosh, because I know Dave Grohl is a big fan of ours, and all that stuff. So I was like, I wonder if he borrowed a little bit from the early Goo Goo Dolls stuff. But yeah, they were fun, and kind of it just worked out perfect, because we ended up having this relationship with Warner Brothers, and they really were kind of getting too big for us, and we couldn't sustain that, so they moved over to Warner Brothers, and then the rest is history.
Sure, yeah. Well, and of course, following that, in the '90s, I mean, I would actually should say, I mean, really, I should ask you, how challenging, I guess, then was it for, like, Metal Blade to survive that decade? Decade that really wasn't, like I said, about metal at all. I mean, did you ever think about changing the strategy or closing anything down? I mean, what was, talk a little bit about that in the '90s, because that was obviously probably the most difficult time, I would imagine, for the label.
Yeah, it was difficult, but I'll say a few things about it. Number one, we never were going to change what we do. Like,
Okay.
the early T-shirts said "Heavy metal will never die," and I believed it was never going to die,
Mhm.
even though a lot of people at that time thought it was. But we moved around. We had a relationship with Warner Brothers. We did a lot of reissue stuff. We reissued Thin Lizzy and Deep Purple and Alice Cooper and Stars and all these different records, which did really well for us. We also did marketing. Like, I loved the whole, grunge, or whatever you want to call it, movement. I love Alice in Chains. I was around them from the early days. I saw Mother Love Bone with Andrew Wood, who were phenomenal. Big fans of it. Alice in Chains, all those bands. So we did a lot of marketing for the majors because the major labels were signing all these bands, but they didn't know what to do with them on the underground level. So we did marketing for Alice in Chains, for Soundgarden, for Nirvana, for all pretty much all those bands, and we would do
Okay.
all the fanzines and radio stuff for the majors, and we got paid to do that. So that helped kind of pay the bills too. The fact that Goo Goo Dolls went massive didn't hurt either, but people forget too, though, the underground, even though in the mainstream metal was dead and non-existent, and the bummer too was all those grunge bands who loved heavy metal and all came and grew up on that stuff. They weren't allowed to say they were into it because it was such a bad word.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
The hair metal thing kind of ruined it for that and the major labels. But
Mm-hmm.
there's a lot of great music. I mean, we had Guar, we had Cannibal Corpse, we had 6 Feet Under, we had King Diamond and Merciful Fate all through the 90s, who made a lot of really great records and were selling a ton of records for underground bands. I mean,
Okay.
both Cannibal Corpse and 6 Feet Under were in the couple 100,000 sales range, which was amazing for that time. So we didn't. It was a struggle for sure, but we did all right. We never hopped on any of these other movements. I never hopped on the new metal thing, and even though we did the behind the scenes stuff with all the Seattle and the grunge stuff, we never really. I'm wearing a Smashing Pumpkin shirt today, as a matter of fact.
Oh, there you go. Yeah.
We also worked with on. But we never did that. We just I kind of just had a feeling, because people ask me all the time, why do you do this? Why do you do that? I go, I'm not gonna believe that this thing is ever gonna die. We're going through a rough patch, but there's still a lot of really great music. And I tell people too now, like, there's a lot of great records that came out in the 90s, like all that Merciful Fate stuff that we did. Like, I think those are really, really good records, and people kind of like, it's the 90s. But I encourage people to go back and listen to stuff from the 90s, because there's a lot of really great metal albums that came out. And that's, of course, spawned the whole, death metal was really big around that time as well. And so it was not easy, for sure. It was difficult, but I don't recall it being, I don't recall any time where we're like, oh my gosh, we're going to go out of business because of this.
Okay. Now, following the 90s, obviously, and probably, I mean, I would say probably maybe a bigger, obviously a bigger change occurred. It had nothing to do with really musical taste, but it had to do obviously with the whole industry itself. When technology took over and traditional means and methods of obviously selling music and had completely flipped on its head. So, I mean, at that point, but at that point too, though, I know metal was climbing back in. It was really back on top again in the early 2000s. It started to really take hold again. But now you had a challenge, obviously, that would assume was probably obviously a lot different in terms of, the traditional means of selling these musical products was not the same, and people weren't, buying music like they once were, obviously. And then once you had all the BitTorrents and all those coming out, all the downloading sites, I mean, I'm just curious, really, I guess, how Metal Blade was able to really, you guys were able to really, adjust, because that's, I think, a lot of the problems a lot of labels had at that time too, was they didn't know really what to do and how to adjust to all these changes. What was it? Well, how were you guys able to really keep that going during that part of, of that period of the label's career?
Well, a few things. Number one, as opposed to resisting change and going against all of that stuff, we kind of embraced it and said, well, how can we use this to our benefit? I mean, you can't stop it. Like, it is what it is. And I understand why people would, want to do the file sharing thing, because at that point, you buy a record, which was 20 some odd dollars, and there might be one good song on it. The rest of it was terrible. So what we did is we embraced that. How can we use this to promote our bands? And the other thing that we try to do, especially with the artists, I mean, as a record label, we're fairly cool, I hope. But we would talk to the fans a lot. But we encourage the artists to talk to the fans, say, like, look, I understand why you're doing this. We get it, understand it. But just so you know, that if you get all your music for free, that means that we don't make any money. And if we can't make any money, then we can't continue to be a band, and we can't make any more music for you. So it kind of became this crazy badge of honor for a lot of metal fans to, like, say, I bought the record, I bought the CD, I bought the record to support the bands. And I mean, that was, there's a couple times where it was, wasn't really great, but once that kind of turned the corner a little bit, that really helped. But what really has helped, and it started with that, is everybody had access to music. Anybody could listen to music for free. So people discovered, bands like Amon Amarth or, Cannibal, whoever it was, because they could listen to it anytime they wanted to for free, and then they'd get into it. And then if they got into the band and the record was good, then they would buy the music. And the other thing it did is it forced bands to make good albums. You couldn't get away with 2 good songs and the rest of the record being terrible because everybody's going to listen to it. And there's no incentive if people can get it for free. It was like, well, I get it for free. It's not a very good record. I'm not going to buy it. But if I get it for free and it's actually really good, okay, I want to support the artist. And we were really lucky in the metal community that so many of the fans did that. And that really helped us through that period of time to where we figured the same thing. Eventually it's going to change. That sort of model can't sustain itself because it was run by, pirates, basically.
Yeah,
a lot
exactly.
of them. So it became a mess. And then the streaming services came about. And then, here we are where you've gone full circle where, for a long time, the music business was making no money, where now, especially the major labels, unfortunately, you're making tons of money. But it all kind of comes around. Like I said, the one time I resisted change was when vinyl left and CDs came in, and I was like, no, vinyl's never going to go away. I grew up with it. I love it. And then within 1 week, all the record stores in the country decided they were not going to have vinyl anymore, and they shipped all the records back. And that's the one time that almost bankrupted the company, where we almost went out of business because I made a dumb mistake by not listening to whatever he kept telling me for months, like stop making vinyl and start making more CDs. And I didn't listen to that. So ever since then, whatever the technology is, whatever it is, I'm going to embrace that and embrace the change as opposed to resisting it, because that's the only way you can really kind of get through it.
Yeah, I mean, and obviously that's what's one of the key reasons what's kept Metal Blade keeping going here after 40 years is because, like you said, embracing those changes. Now, I mean, obviously changes since then. I mean, obviously there's always going to be changes, obviously, but nowadays it's more streaming services. Where people, I mean, we've also just got a much more, I would say, of a saturated market with metal as well, or just music in general. I mean, have you pretty much been able to sort of keep the consistent philosophy that you've had since this all started, in the early 2000s to today, or have you had to make some other adjustments, obviously over the last, say, 10 years or so to keep things going well?
Yeah, I mean, you always have to make adjustments. I think, the one thing that's really interesting in the metal community is that physical product is still very popular. Obviously, vinyl is huge. We can't make enough vinyl to keep everybody happy. But we also still make CDs, and CDs still sell really well. And the one thing that we've learned over the last few years is we learned the marketplace and how many things to manufacture of both CDs and vinyl, so that we keep everybody happy. Because the streaming part is pretty easy. You just put the stuff up there and it does its thing, and you promote the artists. But the other part is a little trickier, but I think we've gotten around it. All the labels do the same thing. You kind of know your marketplace pretty well. So you have to adjust those sort of things. We've gone through cutting down what we do on CDs and making sure we don't have, 50,000 CDs lying around that we can't sell. So I think we've done a fairly good job of adapting to that sort of stuff. And, I mean, the internet has become so important because it gives us as a label a direct line to all of the fans. So everybody knows when a record's coming out, or everybody knows when a single's coming out. So those sort of things have been really helpful. And we've kind of, you swing where before we had a lot of people that were involved in manufacturing, and now we don't have as many people involved with manufacturing, but now we have a whole gigantic social media team. So you kind of adapt with the times and figure out what makes sense and what doesn't make sense and how to move forward. And I'm very lucky to have an unbelievable staff who do great work, and a lot of them are much smarter than me when it comes to some of this stuff. So so it all works.
That's fantastic, man. That's great. Yeah, absolutely. Well, it's funny when I think of Metal Blade and the Headbanger and your old zine, the new Heavy Metal Revue, and just really how you guys built up that scene in the early '80s. It's, as I was saying, it was all fan driven. Yeah, you guys were like, young guys leading the charge of that scene and style of music. I just look at today when I think of how it is today. I mean, obviously it is such a different world in so many ways, so there's not one thing you can pinpoint to, but it just seems like a lot of the younger kids, I mean, they're not as involved with leading the charge for sort of that next generation of metal fans. It seems to me, that, I mean, it's really a lot of the older guys who are continuing to push it. And that's one of the things, obviously, with Metal Blade 2 is, over the years, you never stopped sort of leading the charge into metal. You didn't sit there and rest on your laurels and go, okay, we're going to put out, traditional or classic metal bands and focus on that. You've always sort of stayed ahead of the forefront and tried to really bring up a lot of the new, generation of metal bands and so forth. So, I mean, in your opinion, I mean, how much does, I mean, I guess maybe that void of lack of sort of, I don't know, like lack for a better word, but a lack of leadership among the younger generation of metal fans. I mean, how much does that really contribute, do you think, to metal maybe also not really having the same lure to young music fans as it once did? I mean, I was just in Vegas, a couple of months ago, and I'm in some of the casinos and hotels, and I mean, gone are the other cover bands playing music in there. It's just all, EDM and hip hop DJs on the stage. I mean, so I mean, for you, obviously, what do you see in terms of maybe some of the younger generation that's just really maybe not, do you see this? Let me ask you this way. Do you see the same passion as you guys had as young, and maybe they just don't have, it's just harder, I guess, to do things now in terms of, it's obviously, the kids aren't going to shows and buying shirts and see, CDs or tapes or whatever it is like they once did. I mean, what's your take on all that?
Well, I probably think the opposite, actually. I've been more
Okay.
impressed with how many new bands there are of kids who are like in their early 20s that are coming out now. I mean, there's like so many of them. And we've got a whole bunch of really cool metal labels that are kind of coming up and coming, like, Close Casket, for example. A lot of, young guys who are in their 20s that are
Mhm.
doing this. We've hired pretty recently a few guys in their 20s to do IT stuff, and they're big fans. I'm seeing a lot more younger fans. I think
Okay.
it's a little bit different because the availability of everything is easier, and it's hard. There's not like one area you can go to say like this is going to lead the charge. Like there's no MTV, there's no Headbangers
Mhm.
Ball, there's no
Mhm.
MySpace, so there's no all these things that we kind of would go to in the beginning. So it's a little bit trickier, but I'm pretty happy about where things are going. And I'd say, well, we have a lot of people who've been with Metal Blade forever. We got a lot of people in their, early 30s and 20s now who are just as passionate about the music as we were. And the same thing with journalists and stuff. So I think it's in a pretty good place. It's certainly not mainstream. Uh,
Mhm.
and I kind of like that because it's
Yeah.
still at a level. When you look at concert sales, I believe rock and metal is either one or two in ticket sales every year. Spotify numbers, rock and metal is one or two or maybe third overall sales. It's country and pop and rock and metal. So the
Mhm.
numbers are really good, and a lot of that are younger kids. And even when you go see a band like Iron Maiden or even Amon Amarth or Ghost, whatever it is, there's a half of the people in there are younger. So I think the next generation is going to be okay, and I think you'll see leaders coming up. And the whole other thing is people ask me like, well, there's no headliners anymore. It's like, well, because Metallica and Iron Maiden and all these bands are still at a high level, but you've got Lamb of God and Mastodon and Gojira and Amon Amarth and Ghost, who are all starting to headline and sell out arenas. So it's
Mhm.
just a natural progression of these bands kind of coming up and continue to come up. So I think we're in a pretty good place. It's just old guys like me are still around. So, we're
Mhm.
not leaving and making a lot of room for the younger kids. But I'm pretty positive that we'll be in good shape because gosh, I mean, there's got to be, I don't know, 25 or 30 like underground metal labels that are doing really cool things in different genres. A lot of stuff I haven't even heard of. And I talk to, friends who are younger, like, oh yeah, we love, whatever this label is. And so I think we're in a good spot. I think that naturally, not all of those people are going to continue doing it, but I think there's going to be a few that are going to continue to do this and kind of, you know, help replace if some of these labels go away as they either A, get older, or B, unfortunately get bought by major labels.
Sure. Well, and I think you brought up a great point, and I agree with you 100% with metal not being, mainstream, and I like that too. I just feel like it's always been a genre that really it was born out of just that, almost the antithesis of mainstream. And even though it's obviously it helped the genre in terms of popularity, over the years. I agree where I think it's good where it is right now, underground, where a lot of that's sort of where I think it. I think that's where you get to find musically, just in terms of just the whole culture of the scene. I just think that that's where it's really gonna burgeon, take hold when it's in that space where I always feel like it belongs. Just a personal opinion, but
Yeah,
yeah.
I totally agree, but we also saw what happened in the late 80s and early 90s where it got so big and so commercial and so mainstream that it killed it. Had to go back and reinvent itself. So, I'm always wary of it getting too big. Like I don't mind that the Grammys don't care. I don't mind that, all these TV shows don't care. That's fine with me because that's not the audience that we want. It's just, when Metallica's playing stadiums, all these bands are headlining festivals in Europe that have, sell out, whatever, 75 to 150,000 tickets without even knowing who's playing.
Yeah, I know.
So, and all the, Danny Wimmer festivals here. And, when you look at it especially from the live music point of view, it's bigger than almost every other genre at this point. We just don't get the love from the mainstream, which, like I said, I'm fine with.
That's great. Yeah, no, I agree with you. Well, just going back to with Bob. I mean, having been around him and people who were involved with the scene back then, guys also like John Stradansky, et cetera. I mean, when I listened to the old, and you had been on some of those the Shockwave Skull Sessions episodes, the original ones Bob did back in the mid 2000s. When I'm listening to you guys talk about the old days, it just you sense this glorification you guys all feel that being behind the scene players of the time. Obviously the bands, and that they have the glory, of course, they love that, but also for you guys because of the amount of time and energy and everything you guys put into growing the scene and music along with those musicians. And I think what's even cooler is that the bands and musicians, they always really give you guys credit to the fact that you guys were almost like extended members of the bands, which I always thought is really cool because of, you guys were always there. And from day one, you're still there, obviously now. And you don't really usually see that really often in music in general, where everyone wants to just take the credit for everything themselves and not give it out. So, I mean, when you're sort of, reliving sort of those glory days, I mean, I guess if you want to call it that, I mean, I guess it's got to make you, what you've done now for the last 40 plus years, that much more satisfying, knowing that you really are respected and you're celebrated alongside those band members, and you're not just sort of these guys who no one knows about. You guys are well known to metal fans like myself as being really such a part of the history of these bands. I mean, I would say that's got to be satisfying much more than anything. I would say, especially at this point of your life, as you're getting older, you see, it's been around for 40 years now. You see where it's gone. You still see these bands like Metallica and all these other metal bands that you've worked with selling out, stadium. I mean, arenas left and right still. I mean, how great does that really feel to know that you are, right there alongside all those big name musicians and bands, and not just sort of this guy behind the scenes that no one knows about,
Yeah. Look, it's nice. Obviously, it's I mean, I didn't do any of this for the money or any other reason other than I just love the music, and it's still that way today. But yeah, I mean, it's nice to see that the work that you put in pays off. And the thing for me, especially with the label number one, and also bands that I'm just friends with that aren't even on a label, it's just nice to see them have success and have them be able to do this for a living and have a family, a house, a car, and they're doing this all on music. And that's kind of what ultimately everybody would want to do, is you want as a working either band member or somebody behind the scenes at a label or a magazine or whatever you're at, booking agent, manager, is for you to be able to carve out a living doing this. And I think that's another reason why, metal's done so well, is like there's a lot of really great people that are involved in this, that even behind the scenes that, some people know about and some people don't know about, that do phenomenal work. And it's great that the bands acknowledge that too. It's fun. I was at a big event in Hollywood during Grammy week for a TJ Martell event. And it was like, all the who's of rock and metal, behind the scenes stuff were there. But there's like Robert Trujillo was there, which is great. And Tobias from Ghost was there, which was great. I had a nice conversation with him. And yeah, it's a great group of people to be around with and work with. And it's nice if they say nice things about you every once in a while, I guess.
Sure, absolutely. Well, just a couple last questions about Metal Blade here, Brian. What you got going on now. Obviously, you guys have been really spreading your wings in terms of really getting involved with some non-music related ventures and latest Metal Blade entities that have come out here. You've got some rum and vodka out now. During the pandemic, I know there were some bands that were doing stuff with whiskey and stuff, but it looks like that's an area. It seems like it's an area a lot of metal, and extreme music fans have a really interest in. And so you've obviously now gone into, putting out some liquor as a 40th anniversary celebration type of thing. Is talk a little bit about that. Is that something you're going to continue to do, or is that really just a something that was really done for the 40th anniversary of the label?
Well, the branding stuff, we never really got involved with as a label because we felt like, let's have the band. The band should be able to do it. That's their thing more than us. But after a while, we, a lot of the same people kept coming to us and say, hey, would you want to do a beer or a vodka or something? Always like, well, we didn't really have the infrastructure. So after a while, it's like, well, we've built a brand. I think it kind of started with my first book when I did the history of heavy metal. I was history of Metal Blade Records. That's kind of the first time we did something outside the box necessarily, and it did surprisingly well. So we kind of thought about it. And then a good friend of mine worked on a TV show called Dr. 90210, and he did all the branding for them. And he was like looking for a gig. And I said, well, we've been thinking about doing branding. So once we hired him, that kind of put things on a bit of a fast track because we had somebody to deal with it, because before we didn't really do it. And then we just ran into all these random people, and we've done, candles, beer, vodka, rum. We're doing shoes this year.
Oh, wow.
Just a whole bunch of fun stuff. We just did skateboards.
Cool.
So it's kind of fun to do it and have fun with it. And same thing, there's so many people out there that are now involved in these different companies that are big metal fans. And they're all, like, for example, the guy we're doing the rum with, it's the Key West's first legal rum distillery out of Key West, Florida. And I love Key West, and we're doing a couple things with some people down there. And he's just a massive metalhead and has this rum company and said, let's do a rum. I'm like, all right, so let's do a rum. And so we did that. And the vodka thing's kind of the biggest of all of them, because now we're transitioning into where we might have might become more of a national thing with the bottles in the stores and stuff. So we'll see. It's kind of fun to do. It's interesting to do things outside of the metal world, but then you start finding out that things aren't so different from what we do to what they do and other things. So it's fun and interesting. We'll see how it all goes. I mean, it could all fall apart tomorrow, but hopefully not.
Well, no, I mean, and there seems, because there's so many breweries out there that have, they make these specialty beers for a lot of bands specifically. I'm here in the Bay Area in Oakland, and they've got this Ghost Town Brewing here, which is a big metal, sort of a death metal brewery. So it's definitely, I think, an area that people definitely enjoy seeing branding, their vices with obviously their favorite music and so forth. So I think it's a great thing. And as you just talked about, you mentioned your first book. Well, I noticed you've also got another book, I believe, coming out, For the Sake of Heaviness, The History of Metal Blade Records. That was obviously the book you put out in 2017, but I recently became aware that you will be releasing a follow-up titled Swinging the Blade, More Stories from Metal Blade Records. I believe I saw it's supposed to come out this spring. Is that still on track? And what could people, I guess, expect in that book that was a little different than the first one?
Yeah. So by much to my surprise, the reaction to the first book was overwhelmingly really positive, which was great. But I got a lot of questions like, it should have been longer, but I didn't, I don't want to bore people. And also, like, we want more stories about some of the bands. We want to hear about the obscure bands, all these sort of things. So I started talking to BMG, who published the first book, and some other people. And I said, should I do another one? And they said, absolutely. So unfortunately, the pandemic kind of put everything behind, because I finished the book 2.5 years ago, and then the pandemic hit, and then we had a paper shortage. So this should have been out it's coming out in May is the official release date, but it should have been out last May. But the paper shortage and everything else kind of messed it up. But it's up for pre-sale on Amazon now, and we've finally got a few copies, so I gave them to a few people, the staff and stuff. So far the reaction's been all right. So hopefully people will enjoy it as well. But so that's coming out in May. Like I said, it's on Amazon now for pre-order.
Great. Yeah, the first book was fantastic. I've got it, and I'm glad there is coming, because there was more things I was hoping or wanted to hear about. So I'm great you're putting that out, and so I encourage everyone out there to go ahead and check that out when it comes out. Brian, anything else that we could look forward to that Metal Blade's got lined up that we're not privy to yet?
There's just all sorts of stuff. We've got a Cannibal Corpse record coming out that. The last one did really well. It was really good. And those guys kept telling me this one's just as good, if not better, which you're like, really? That last one was really good.
Mhm.
But they're like the harshest critics sometimes, and it is really, really good. So we're really excited for that. New Cattle Decapitation's coming out. A whole bunch of bands putting stuff out. I'm excited about a lot of newer bands we have too. One of which being this band called 200 Stab Wounds that we signed. That kind of reminds me of another band. Younger kids. It kind of remind me a combination of Cannibal Corpse meets Power Trip, like
Wow.
somewhere in
Nice.
between there. They're really good. I saw them at Cycle Fest in Vegas, and I'm old. I've seen thousands and thousands of shows and thousands of bands, and I don't rarely get excited about things, but they blew me away at that festival. I was like, oh my gosh. So that's coming out. A
Okay.
whole bunch of other really cool new band stuff. So just go to all the Metal Blade socials, metalblade.com, all that sort of stuff, and you can get all the info there.
Fantastic, fantastic. Well, again, Brian, we appreciate you coming on to talk to us about Bob and the history of Metal Blade, and obviously, we look forward to Metal Blade to continue to carry the torch for a fifth decade. I mean, could you see just quickly? Could you see Metal Blade being one of those, a company that outlasts you? Let's put it that way. That
I hope
continues
so. I
past you.
mean,
Yeah.
that's the plan at present.
Okay.
We have a
Mm,
plan for that, and yeah, I certainly hope so because number one, we've built something really cool here, and it would be nice if this thing, continues on. That's why I've never sold it to a major because I just worry about. And I've seen what my other friends have done. They sold their labels to the major, and eventually it kind of goes away, and the name
mhm.
goes away, and all that sort of stuff. And I don't want that to happen with Metal Blade. So hopefully, again, knock on wood, that's the plan. So we'll
Fantastic.
see how it goes.
Awesome. Well, great. Well, again, Brian, thanks so much for coming on. I appreciate it, man.
Yeah, no problem.
All
And
right.
again, what a great guy Bob was, and what a lasting memory. He's left a legacy of a guy that was an integral part of heavy metal worldwide. So tribute to him.
Yes. Thanks.